You're listening to
and such a short amount of time to do it in. Really...
a Mamma Mia podcast.
Do you know what? I think it's going to be harder to do that than to maybe take off a couple of, not all of them, but have you got
Darling,
the one
they're
that
about
jingles?
20. I will be very mindful and I will just tell them that I'm refuse to take off my
Absolutely, I
noise.
love it.
I tell the sound techs that really it's their problem, not mine.
Exactly, and it is. It's Ronnie's world. We all just have to live in it. When was the last time you were hungry? If poverty or homelessness aren't things you're familiar with, you probably aren't hungry very often. Or if you are, it's the kind of hunger that doesn't have anxiety attached to it. Because you know you can just go and buy something to eat or make yourself a snack. For millions of Australians, though, the idea of having enough to eat is a luxury. They never take food for granted. Hunger is a real part of their daily lives. And being hungry, not knowing where or how you can get your next meal or a meal for your family, that changes you. Ronni Kahn didn't know any homeless people the first night that she took food to a homeless shelter back in 2003. But that night, and what she did and what she saw, not only changed her life, it would change the lives of millions of other Australians.
You start by having a dream and literally telling everybody that this is what you're going to do, because I had no idea how I was going to do it. I certainly didn't have a roadmap. I didn't have a business plan. I said, I need a van because I know there's food and I know there are people and I'm going to put them together.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman and you're listening to No Filter, an interview podcast with people like Ronni, who tell their stories very candidly and aren't afraid to be vulnerable. In 2004, Ronni Kahn founded OzHarvest, Australia's leading food rescue organisation that has provided 160 million meals to men, women and children of all ages who would have otherwise gone hungry all around Australia. Yes, Ronni Kahn is inspirational. That is not news. She's an exceptional business leader, a tireless advocate for disadvantaged people, and a wildly successful founder and CEO. But she's also a woman who had a story going on in her private life alongside her work that for many years she was way too ashamed to share.
I must have been so naive and so desperate that whatever bullshit he gave me, I bought.
Here's my chat with Ronni. And just a note, you may hear some jingling or background noise, and that's because if you've ever seen a photo of Ronni, you'll know that she has the most fabulous and very unique sense of style. She wears a lot of jewellery, bangles and earrings, and she's got these great glasses and necklaces, and she couldn't take all of it off. She couldn't actually take any of it off. It's very much her. So you might hear some of that in the background. Ronni, I wanted to ask you a question that is so superficial, and that is about your style. You have such a distinctive look. And when I was researching before I spoke to you and looking through the book and watching some old footage of you, you used to look like, and I can say this because I'm Jewish, a very sort of middle-class, typical Jewish suburban woman. South African Jewish woman, actually. It's even more specific than that.
Funny.
And now you are like so incredibly cool. You've got this very distinctive look, and I know podcasts aren't a visual medium, but you've got this grey cropped hair, big glasses, always wear incredible jewellery. How did you discover that style?
You know, it's funny, Mia, because actually I won InStyle's Woman of Style at least 10 years ago, maybe 8. And I'm not sure. I've always loved fashion. But I've never wanted to be a slave to fashion. So I think what's evolved is as I've come to know who I am and as I have been willing to express without fear what I believe expresses me, so my style has evolved. So you're right. I used to dye my hair and wear it curly and care about the makeup I wore. And then slowly I just thought, hey, I just am who I am. And let's just choose the things I love.
Often when women find that in such a dramatic way as you seemed to, it's about finding something inside. Did it coincide with when you started OzHarvest and found your purpose?
Absolutely. There's not even any doubt that as I got deeply and more intensely steeped in doing my OzHarvest work and less of my business work, so I evolved and I guess blossomed. I mean, some people might think that I turned into a weed, but I think I blossomed. But I will share something funny with you, because one of my girlfriends, when I told her I was going to start OzHarvest and start a charity and build a charity, she looked at me and she said, "Does that mean you won't buy clothes anymore and you're just going to wear," I said, "sackcloth and ashes?" Nope, I don't think so.
I want to go back way before OzHarvest to growing up in South Africa under apartheid. Now, living in South Africa in a regime of legislated racism, how can you have values, or how do you live your values of equality when you're legally prevented from treating people equally?
So that, I think, was the biggest dilemma for anyone who stayed in South Africa and who did believe somewhat differently. Some people were brave and courageous and fought the system. My parents didn't, but did the best they could by sending me to a school that was considered liberal. And I use the word liberal in the term that it meant in South Africa, which meant left-leaning, as opposed to the Australian political demographic. Very carefully, they chose to put myself and my sisters in a youth movement that espoused morality. And so we were getting doses of the good stuff and being told that how we lived was the bad stuff. I think those values are really the values that I imbibed and not what was around me.
When you were 17, you went to study in Israel and you lived on kibbutz. Can you explain what kibbutz is?
Yeah. So I went to study on kibbutz and then I landed up living there. And a kibbutz is a socialist society. It's a community that has chosen to live on socialist ideals, that everybody works according to their ability and everybody gets according to their need. And that need is divided out equally. So, for example, there was no financial remuneration for the work that you did. You were given a roof over your head. You were given food, a dining room. And for little treats, you could go to a store. We had like bingo cards, and you could use your coupons at the store that might have a slightly better soap than you were allocated, because everyone is allocated the very core basic needs. So it was actually a fascinating experience and very idealistic.
What did you learn from living on kibbutz, and how did families work there?
So on many of the kibbutzim, the plural of kibbutz is kibbutzim, many of them were started really by idealists who children were not their main goal. Living this very socialist life was very important to them. And many of the kibbutzim, the first kibbutzim, when women started falling pregnant, would put the children in a children's house right from the day they were born. The kibbutz I lived on, when a child was born, they were with you until they were 6 weeks old, and then they went into daycare from 6 weeks old, but they slept at home with you overnight. So the kids were brought up in beautiful, small community little groups, and then they went into kindergarten in bigger groups. But a lot of the work for women was looking after smaller groups of kids. As the kibbutz grew and there were more families, then there were more children, and yeah.
And there are still kibbutzim now in Israel, aren't there? Like some people go and live on kibbutz as sort of a life experience after school or during a period of their life.
Yeah, people can volunteer to be on kibbutz and work for a while. But strangely enough, the kibbutz movement has evolved, shifted, changed, and there are not that many successful kibbutzim left, because as capitalism grew and as financial world and economics grew, some of those kibbutzim that started off really perhaps with agriculture at their core, the agriculture they depended on did not become sufficient to allow for the kibbutz movement to grow. So there are not as many left as there are. The kibbutz that I was actually on has turned into the most successful, financially successful and economically successful kibbutz, because they went into electronics early on in the piece and started building computers and were very innovative.
How long did you stay and why did you decide to leave?
I stayed on the kibbutz for 10 years and chose to leave because it turns out that as much as the ideology was incredibly attractive, I found it very difficult to live with. I found it difficult to be told that actually we need you in the children's house. And really, I had no aspiration to be a child carer. I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to do other things. I wanted to experiment. And so the needs of the kibbutz bumped up against my independence and my need for individuality. But I didn't know that before. I didn't know that actually I had that streak, that independent streak in me. But it became very apparent. And so I pushed and pushed. My husband was very happy there. He loved it. He was like a little pig into shit because he was on a tractor in the fields, living a dream world. If you were an urban boy who grew up with a fantasy of living an ideological life.
Had you met there and did you have children while you were living there?
We had met in South Africa and we had children on the kibbutz. And I had always thought that kibbutz was wonderful if you're very young or very old, because it's the community looks after you in both cases. It's just when you're in the middle that it could be a challenge.
So why Australia?
Well, the interesting thing is that I have a sister who lives in LA, and my then husband had a brother who'd come to live in Australia. And somehow Australia felt much more familiar than America. And I thought the idea of bringing up children after having lived in this very, in a way, beautiful and sheltered environment, to go into the epitome of capitalism in the Western world of America felt a step too far.
What struck you as different about Australia after living in South Africa and Israel?
Well, coming from Israel, Australia felt like, honestly, I'd landed in the land of milk and honey, because if you worked hard, you made your opportunities. Life felt very much freer and safer, very much safer. Probably the biggest difference between South Africa and Australia was the level of safety. In South Africa, there always was a fear, even though by the time we came to live in Australia, it was much closer to Mandela being released and South Africa changing significantly. But then again, there was this huge level of fear around violence. So South Africa was very much more fraught with tension. Israel was very much fraught with tension. Australia felt like, I hadn't even heard the term laid back, but it was the epitome of laid back.
My dad tells a story of when he came to Australia from South Africa in the 60s as a form of political protest, because that's the only way you could protest apartheid back then was to leave. And he said he remembers his family just marveling that the front page of the newspapers were like about some cricket game, like Australia lost in the Ashes or something. And his family were like, oh, what an amazing country. It's not about race riots and it's not about, wars. It's about a cricket game. What is this magical land?
Exactly. That was still so in the 80s.
You built a very successful career as an events planner. And one night, it was about in 2002, wasn't it, when you looked around at the end of an event. What did you see?
Well, I saw the culmination of what I'd seen but hadn't noticed, and what I'd seen and not done. I put on this event that was just an exquisite opulent, outrageous event for about 1,000 people. And I had created these market stalls, and food was just gushing everywhere. It looked like a Roman banquet. And I also had gushing wine and beer. And 1,000 Aussies came to an event where there was free wine and beer. And within 5 minutes, they were pissed. And all that food wasn't touched. And a lot of my events, and this one in particular, was off-site, was not in a simple hotel venue. The food was just going to go to waste. And it just struck me that it was outrageous, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of perfectly untouched good food. And so I loaded it up in my vehicle and took it. It was late at night, and I took it to the one agency that I kind of had sort of seen on my way home, right behind the Ferrari and the Porsche dealers. I'd often seen men hanging around. And it was extraordinary because they were so grateful for this food. It was very confronting to step over and around all these men that were waiting, and I didn't even know if the food would be received well because I didn't even know who to call. I just went and knocked on the door and said, I've got a car full of food. And in a way, it was just so easy. I mean, it was hard, but it was, oh my God, all that food just went to feed people. And so I became a rogue food rescuer for a while.
What did that involve?
Well, just making sure that the food that was left over at any of my events, I made sure that I actually loaded up. And after I'd gone to that one hostel, I said, is there anywhere else that I could go? And in a way, they were a little nervous. They didn't really want to tell me of other places because they were loving all this food coming to them, and they were nervous that they wouldn't get it all. I said, look, there's plenty. Trust me. Is there anywhere else? And slowly I found other places to take that food to.
Your marriage had ended around this time, and
Yep.
you were dating a guy who we will call Anton. It's not his name.
Yes. No.
How did you and Anton meet, and what was he like?
We met through the industry. We met through the hospitality industry. He was one of the suppliers, and he was very elegant, charming, cultured, and seemed to look after me a lot.
Was he your first serious relationship after your divorce?
He certainly was, yep.
What's that like,
And-
dating after a long marriage?
Oh my God, it is so confronting, so hard. First of all, you've been with someone for 25, 28 years. You know, you don't have to worry about taking your clothes off.
Yeah.
It's a challenge. It's a challenge, but he seemed to manage and like what he saw. And so he was so charming that he made me feel very comfortable. And yeah, it seemed to work really well for a while.
So you'd been married really young and you were coming out into the world again in your 40s.
I hadn't dated. I married the guy that I went out with when I was 15.
Oh, wow.
You know, so dating was like, oh my God.
So this was like the second guy you ever slept with?
Yep.
Wow, that must have been very nerve-wracking.
Well, he was good.
Yeah, evidently. How long had you guys been together, you know, when you started thinking about this reassignment of wasted food?
About 6 years. I think the joy of, first of all, finding someone, and secondly, someone who did treat me like a princess. It wasn't that my husband didn't treat me well, but, you know, after 25 years, you take each other for granted.
Sure.
And this man literally bowled me over because he seemed to be very wealthy, and we'd never had money, and bought me beautiful gifts and treated me to wonderful experiences, introduced me to the world of opera, introduced me to culture, traveled, took me around the world. I mean, it was a bit enchanting, really.
Did you think he might be the second Mr. Ronni Kahn?
Definitely. You know, I thought he was my man. But then there were some really strange things that I chose to overlook, because we sometimes do choose to
We
overlook.
do, particularly if the sex is good. What was the first red flag that, looking back, you didn't pick up?
So the first friend I met of his was a woman who was not very friendly. And he had told me, I knew that he'd been married before. And she kind of intimated that he'd been married a few times before. And he'd never told me that. And when I confronted him, he said, oh, yes, I had been married once before. Now, why didn't you tell me? He made some lovely story and I bought it, Why was it important? I'm here with you now. That was so long ago in the past. Anyway, I bought it. But the next real thing was I'd actually come home from somewhere and I saw him walking across the road and I thought it would be really cool to just kind of trick him and say, hey, where are you? Like expecting him to say, I'm on the corner of Napier Street. And he said, I'm in Lakemba. Now we were in Paddington. And I said, yeah, right. No, you're not. I'm sure you're not. Where are you really? He said, no, I'm in Lakemba. And it was like, what? I then bowled up in front of him and he kind of just didn't even, I must have been so naive and so desperate that whatever bullshit he gave me, I bought. And it kind of freaked me out. And I think that for a while I thought maybe we'd break up. But you know what? I didn't.
In isolation, it seems like a really silly thing to break up over, doesn't it? Like if everything else is great.
Yeah, but it was weird.
Yeah.
And there were a few other little weird things that started happening.
Around lies.
Yeah. Around not telling me the truth. I discovered that he was 10 years older than he had told me. Now, he looked great, but he was actually 10 years older than he had told me.
And how many times had he been married?
Well, I will share this with you that I have not told anybody. I thought he'd been married 4 times. Well, he had told me once. I then discovered actually that he'd been married 4, but when the book came out, 2 women contacted me.
No, more wives.
Yes, I am serious. Yeah.
Wow.
And a child that I didn't know about.
When did you find all this out and how did you confront him?
When I discovered, I happened to pick up his passport and, it meant there was a way bigger age difference than I thought. And he just said, why was that important? He just had this absolute ability to skim over things and make me feel that I was stupid for even bringing them up.
Gaslighting.
Yeah, completely. Exactly.
The lavish lifestyle that he had or that he seemed to have. I mean, when you look back, what do you think his motivations were for being with you?
He kept saying he was going to hire a PR agent because he wanted to build me up into the biggest event producer I could ever be. I never really quite understood. I think he lived this fantasy life and he just kept moving on, it turns out, finding women before the relationship ended so that he could move on to the next. I think he got a lot of pleasure out of being this generous charmer, which he actually wasn't, and he was living off money that wasn't really there, and clearly it would have been mine soon. But luckily I came to my senses.
So living off money from other women.
Yeah.
It seems like this is a tangent on your story, but the 2 points meet in a conversation that you had over breakfast one morning when you were looking at this food charity as a possible idea and you had a conversation with him. How did that conversation go?
I was feeling decidedly uncomfortable, and that one weekend when he said, let's just go to Hong Kong for this party.
Oh.
And when I turned around and said, actually, I don't want to go to Hong Kong for the weekend, it made me think, what? Who am I? I mean, it would have been in my dream world to flit on an aeroplane to Hong Kong for a party at some very fancy thing. And I just thought, what the hell has happened to me? What has happened to my values? And just everything started feeling weird, which then made me start thinking about, well, I've got this problem, there's food, there's this. And when I said, I think maybe I'm thinking of starting an organization that will rescue this food and deliver it and start a charity. And he said, I don't believe in charity. Ooh. And I just looked at this man and thought, okay, the values have just gone. There's no alignment anymore. But it was hard to extricate oneself. It's not always so easy to extricate out of these things.
But you did.
Well, I did, but I did land up taking an AVO out against him.
Were you
Not
nervous writing about this in the book? Because you've not spoken about it before.
No, I'd never spoken about it and actually had no intention of putting it in the book. But I co-wrote the book with my daughter-in-law, and she knew that story, and she just said, of course it's got to be in the book. And I said, of course it doesn't. Why would I make myself look so dumb?
Yeah, because it must have felt humiliating to realize.
So humiliating. So confronting and so humiliating. But she said, it is pivotal because it was that moment that you and your values realized how out of alignment you've got. How could we tell that story without putting that in? And I have to say, sharing that has been the most confronting part, obviously, of the book. And I had to let it go, but it took so long to let it go.
I've interviewed a number of women who that's happened to, and the shame that's piled on top of the fact that you're already a victim of someone else's abuse or deceit is just the most awful thing.
Absolutely. And that's exactly how I felt, but felt quite liberated actually once I realized it doesn't own me. That story doesn't own me, and it's not who I am anymore.
It's who he is. It has nothing to do with you.
Exactly. And so in a way it was incredibly, I'm so grateful now, funnily enough, that it's in the book, even though I still cringe thinking about it. It will always be a cringe moment for me. But it did teach me a lot, and it helped me grow.
You're listening to No Filter with Ronni Kahn. So how do you start a food charity?
That's a great question. You start by having a dream and literally telling everybody that this is what you're going to do, because I had no idea how I was going to do it. I certainly didn't have a roadmap. I didn't have a business plan. I said, I need a van because I know there's food and I know there are people, and I'm going to put them together. And extraordinarily, people bought into that. People believed me because I knew I'd had lived experience of seeing the waste. And I knew that there were people in need, and everybody knew that. And, you know, the beautiful part was I never had to teach anybody that throwing good food away was a bad thing. Somebody had already told them. Your mother, your father, your grandmother, an aunt, an uncle, somewhere had said to you, eat your food because there's someone starving somewhere. And so it was a bit like when I started telling people, it was like, hallelujah, what can we do to help?
Yeah, you've got to fix the problem.
Exactly. And those people who said, no, it's never going to work, I just said, well, mind out my way. I don't need to listen to you because I think it'll work, because I knew that there was food and I could see that it could work.
How big is OzHarvest today?
It's huge. 250 staff, over 3,500 volunteers. You know, it costs us about $25 million to run. We've delivered over 165 million meals. But if I took the in-kind, you know, I'd probably get $10-15 million worth of in-kind a year. So it's an extraordinary business.
How does it fund itself?
Well, we have programs that are revenue generating that bring us in a good few $1 million, but we also are very reliant on philanthropy, on donations, on trusts, foundations, and corporates. We've never been very high on government funding until 2020. 2020 hit, 3% of our funding came from government. But in the onslaught of the pandemic, where the food supply chain was hit, panic buying, our agencies needed more and more food, people needed more and more food, we suddenly, for the first time, saw that there was less food available than we needed, and we had to purchase. So I lobbied and we got government funding, which has allowed us to roll out extraordinary programs, extraordinary.
So, Ronni, you started with that one homeless shelter, and I know exactly the one that you mean.
Yeah.
It's right behind the office where I'm recording this podcast, actually.
Right, exactly.
So I know it very well. I could probably see it out the window. Who does OzHarvest supply to now?
So we support over 1,600 charitable organisations, from the likes of Mission Australia to Salvos to St. Vinny's, but to tiny little ones that might have 5 women who suffer from domestic violence, or 5 women who fell off the tracks and therefore had to make a living doing whatever it is they could, but need food, or kids or elderly. We service any demographic, anyone that goes to any space to get food for free. We deliver that food for free. So food is often a magnet. So if you go to an agency looking for food, there's often all these ancillary support systems that you can get. And by giving food to these agencies, it means they're saving, some of them, between $50,000 and $100,000 a year on their food bill, which they can then put into other services. So it's a very beautiful service.
Can you tell me about some of the people you've met along the way and what they sort of illustrate about the very complex needs of people living below the poverty line?
So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Last week, I went to a coffee shop in Double Bay. And
very fancy suburb.
Very fancy suburb. The waiter sat me down and looked at me, and his eyes filled and his mouth smiled, and he said, "You're Ronni, aren't you? You're OzHarvest, aren't you?" He had an accent, and I looked at him and I said, "Yes, I am. And who are you?" And he said, "I'm Bruno." I said, "Aha." He said, "I'm an international student. During COVID, lost my job, no university, couldn't get back to my home. Government didn't give us any support, but you fed me. So I want to say thank you." In the restaurant, in another space, this woman, this young girl, just looked at me and her eyes filled with tears. She said, "Can I take a photo of you to send to my mama, because you helped me and I told my mother about you." I know. So these are people who are beautiful, who look just like us. They're not stereotypes. They came here as part of an industry, a $50 billion industry, that during COVID, we did nothing to help them. Our government did nothing to help them.
Wow. Ronni, just finally, what do people misunderstand about the people who are out there who are hungry?
So we judge people so quickly. They don't realize that this could happen to me or you in a second. You know, you fall off the cracks. Let's say your husband leaves you. And let's say you had a job with kids and you were relying on him for the rent, and suddenly your job doesn't cover all of the expenses, and you don't have family, and then suddenly you've got someone banging on your door saying you have to move, you can't stay here, and you just spiral into a cycle that is easy to spiral down, but very hard to climb up. And I have seen, yes, they're the stereotypes of people who've been on the street for years and they have mental challenges, but they too were just like us at one point. So it's just never, ever judge. I visited a family yesterday that the grandmother is now looking after 4 kids because her son went astray. His wife became a drug addict. There's this 65-year-old woman living with 4 children under the age of 8 on a pension, trying to make a living, trying to help them. You know, did she plan that? No. People fall through the cracks, and we are not here to judge. All we can do is serve. All we can do is support and never judge. Our free supermarket, people come dressed looking beautiful. Well, who am I to judge with what they need or what they don't need? If somebody's standing in a line and willing to come into a supermarket, that's free. They have a problem and they need to get food. Who am I to judge?
And Ronni, did you find love again?
I actually have found love again.
I'm so glad to hear
That's very new. That's very new. So it's very exciting. When I least expected it, I wasn't looking. It's the first time I'd lived alone after I left my second husband. And I realized I really needed to learn to live alone. I'd gone from one relationship to the next, and really was so comfortable now, finally, just being who I need to be, when and how and what. And boom, I met someone and I am so happy.
Well, they're very lucky.
And I'm happy for today.
Yeah.
And all I can say is I am so grateful, and I'd rather love again and perhaps ever hurt again than not love. But I think this one's a keeper.
Well, you're certainly a keeper. We've been lucky to have kept you as long as we have today, and we're lucky to have you in Australia. Ronni, thank you so much for everything you do. Your book is phenomenal, as are you. And your noisy jewellery. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Ronni. The book that she's referring to is a fantastic memoir that she wrote with her daughter-in-law, Jessica Kahn. It's called A Repurposed Life. We'll put a link to it in the show notes, and I highly recommend it. And if you want to hear more about OzHarvest and Ronni's story in your ears, you can listen to our Lady Startup episode that we did with her, and we'll link to that also in the show notes. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share it with a friend. You can find more episodes of No Filter on Spotify. This episode was produced by Mel Sauer, and the executive producer of No Filter is Elissa Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, and I'll see you on the Mamma Mia app.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.